Howdy, folks. This is Tony here, wishing all of you a happy Independence Day. Now, I'm going to do something I have never done on this channel before, and I'm not even sure if it gets done on a lot of channels. I am going to read for you the entire Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to explain throughout my reading how certain parts of it are very similar to what we as Americans are experiencing today. So hopefully this allows you to put yourselves in the shoes of the founders of this nation and truly understand what made them so angry that they felt the need to form their own country. You're welcome to think of this as a podcast where you could just be driving or doing chores and you just want to listen to it. So without further ado, let's begin. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Wow, what a beautiful opening. Now, let's kind of unpack what's going on here to make sure that we understand. So, notice that the founders said it became necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. So, at a certain point, a nation can no longer stay as one, it must split. It becomes necessary. There's no way to keep it together. You could almost think of this in cell division, right? At one point, when a cell is about to divide, it is so large that if it tried to stay that way, it wouldn't sustain itself. It's got to divide in two. Now, here's something very important. Notice it says the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Now, a lot of people will try to argue against Christianity influencing America's laws. A lot of people will try to silence Christians by saying, well, if America was founded on Christian principles, why isn't God mentioned anywhere in the Constitution? And while I do kind of understand where they're coming from, what you need to see is that God is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. God is mentioned in the underlying reason for which we became an independent nation and separated from Britain. It doesn't say the laws of nature and nature's evolution. No, it says the laws of nature and nature's God. So America was founded as a nation whose intent was to fear God. Does that mean that all the rich and powerful people that founded America feared God equally? Of course not. As I recall, I think Benjamin Franklin was an atheist, and I know that a lot of the founders were Freemasons, and there's a lot of information there within Freemasonry that contradicts the Bible. Of course there is. But when you look at our Declaration of Independence, when you look at what the average American believed back then, they feared God. So to try to dismiss God out of America's identity is to dismiss the American identity. God is part of our identity, and it's inextricably linked. We were not founded as a nation who's designed to allow college-educated atheists to trample over all of us. When people say freedom of religion, what it means is the government cannot force you to go to church. It does not mean the government's required to rule in favor of the atheist all the time. Anyway, notice how it says, nature's God entitle them. What does it mean to be entitled? It means that God has given you a right. See, this is the founders arguing that our rights derive from God, not the government. Anyway, it says they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So if you're going to separate from the country you came from, you must have a reason to do it. This is what the founders believed. Now let's continue to the paragraph you all know and love very well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now let's just stop there for a moment. Notice that the founders said these truths are self-evident, meaning you do not have to justify why they exist. They just simply exist. But today's government does not want you to believe your rights are self-evident. They want you to believe your rights come from them. Rights are self-evident and rights come from God. Notice, all men are created equal. Another reference to God. It does not say all men evolved equality. It does not say all men get their equality from the government. It says all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Don't skip the word unalienable. It's very important. What that means is that your rights follow you your whole life. Their rights are unalienable. A human being has rights. And just because a human being has an opinion that differs from yours does not alienate them from their rights. It's unalienable. So the government does not have the right to prosecute and persecute you just for believing differently than it does, because your rights are inalienable. Now let's continue. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So let's reread that because it's very important. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Who are the governed? Those are the people, the citizens. The rights of the people come from God, and the rights of the government come from the governed. Or in other words, come from the people. Listen, your rights do not come from the government. The government's rights come from you. The government has as much power as you, the people, allow it to have. That is how the order of things should be. Let's continue. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So is it your job to keep the government safe, or is it the government's job to keep you safe? Is it your job to make the government happy, or is it the government's job to make you happy? Remember, the government's rights come from you. This is how America was founded. This is what the founders believed, and we can see it in their writings. Let's continue. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So what are the founders saying here? First of all, they are saying that when America was founded, they did not want the government to be changed for a light and transient cause. Light and transient means you are feeling emotional about something in the moment, but then it eventually fades away, because transient means something that's here today, gone tomorrow. You think about, for example, fads, things that are popular today that are forced upon people today that were not the case before. For example, forcing people to declare pronouns and things of this nature. These are light and transient things. These are not serious, fundamental rights. You do not have a right to force someone to use a pronoun. That is a light and transient cause. That is something not serious enough to change the government. Like people want to stack the Supreme Court, for an example, or fundamentally alter our government. But let's look at something else the founder said that was a mouthful here. They said that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. In other words, you have a lot of people who are afraid to rise up against a tyrannical government because they say in their minds, well, I may be getting taxed higher, but at least there's still Chick-fil-A. At least there's still Netflix. At least I can still go get a drink whenever I want it. At least I can still go to Amazon.com or go to the movies. When life is comfortable enough, physically comfortable enough, people will put up with injustice as long as you keep them happy. There's a famous saying that says, if you give the people enough bread and circus, they will never revolt. And what do we see? Men that could be used to save this country, or to even institute a new one if it were necessary. Instead, they are ruining their bodies with beer, ruining their minds with Netflix, making themselves totally useless to any real cause that might require their strength to deliver the people of this nation in the future. Let's continue. But when a long, train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. The founders thought of the future. That's why they said future security. They also said that governments that have a long line of abuses, governments that have a long list of things they have done wrong to the people, these governments eventually become despotic. That's why they mentioned despotism here. Despotism is when the government has all of the authority and all of the rights. You have none of the authority. You have none of the rights. If the government wants to harvest your organs, you're getting your organs harvested. If the government wants to throw you in jail for praying, you're going to jail for praying. There's no court that will save you. There's no protest that will save you. Think about governments like Iran, for an example, where simply protesting is enough to get you having acid thrown at your face or beheaded. These are examples of despotism. And what the founders believed is it is the people's duty to throw off governments that are despotic. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and now it is the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. So in other words, the founders within their colonies were experiencing despotism under King George III. And later on in this declaration, they're going to list what they were going through. It says the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Now let's talk about what it means to usurp, where you see usurpations. Usurping is when you take authority that does not belong to you. I will give you an example of this. Let's say you have your neighbor comes over to your house, kicks your door down, and starts telling your family what to do. No, that's your house. You tell your family what to do. Your neighbor's supposed to tell his family what to do. But if your neighbor kicks down your door and wants to tell your family what to do, that's usurpation, because the government is, because your neighbor is overstepping his boundary. Likewise, the founders were saying that King George III had overstepped his boundaries and was imposing into the private lives of citizens, imposing into their lives in a way that he did not have the right to. Let's continue. It says the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So, in other words, King George III was a dictator, and when it says let the facts be submitted, let's tell the whole world why King George III was a dictator. And it's very fitting that in this article that features the Declaration of Independence and mentions right next to the evils of King George III, we've got a picture of King Joe II here. But let's continue. This is where we start to talk about a lot of the evil dictatorship, the evil despotic nature of King George III. Now, please bear in mind that the royal family are still dictators. A lot of the laws that unfairly target Christians in Great Britain still have to be signed off by the monarch. Laws, for example, that make it illegal for a Christian to pray outside of an abortion clinic, that you see Christians getting arrested for using so-called hate speech and things of this nature. Any law that Parliament passes, the king or queen has to sign off on it. So, Elizabeth II, dictator. King Charles II, dictator. These guys are still dictators. I don't understand why people think the royal family is now much nicer than they were before. It's still the same family. It's the same political empire. It's the same blood-soaked empire that caused our forebears to throw off their shackles. That is one aside as to why I personally do not understand Americans' obsession with the royal family. Why would you want to be celebrating something that you probably have ancestors who shed their blood to get rid of? Let's continue here. Let's see what the founders are saying that King George III has done wrong. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Now, what does it mean by his assent to laws there? Well, just like I have explained, in the parliamentary system, the Parliament of England writes the law, and the king must give a final thumbs up or thumbs down. Very similar to how in America, Congress may pass a law, but a president must either sign or veto the law. So King George III was refusing to sign good bills that would have helped the colonists out. Might you see something similar happening in today's America? Joe Biden refusing to sign bills that defund the overbloated IRS. Joe Biden refusing to sign bills that get rid of the government taxing you to death. Joe Biden refusing to sign good laws because he's got a political agenda to meet. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. So in other words, King George III didn't even let his governors, the people that were in charge of the colonies, pass good laws. He would tell those governors, you need to wait until I give you permission to pass that law. The governor would say, all right, king, we're going to wait for you to pass this, give us permission to pass this law. And the king says, I'll get back to it later, and never does. So basically someone who has completely turned his back on the legislative needs of his country, completely refuses to write any good laws himself or sign any good laws. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So what's going on here? He is refusing people's right to be represented in Congress. You might see this a lot going on, and frankly, both parties have done some of this, but it's mainly done by Democrats in deep blue cities, where you have the modern example of this might be gerrymandering, where you try to redraw the district in such a way that makes your political party unbeatable. In some ways, you could look at that as influencing how people get proper representation. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Now, you might think about this as what King George III was essentially doing is trying to go around the legislature, trying to go around the duly elected legislatures in order to get whatever he wants done passed. Now, Joe Biden does this today as well. He might use the ATF, the FBI, and other intelligence and law enforcement federal agencies to fatigue the people into obeying his will, to try to go around Congress. Rather than have Congress pass a law making a requirement upon citizens and he simply signs it, he'd rather just use an executive order. When he first came into the White House, he signed a historically high amount of executive orders, all aimed at crushing the average American. Next part of this declaration here. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. So not only does he go after the citizens, he goes after the person the citizens voted for. He's prosecuting and he's opposing his political opponents. Very similar to, you see most of the time, you'll see some kind of conservative politician that gets more audits done on them, more investigations done on them, more attempts to get them out of office. But whenever you see a Democrat do something that's even remotely scandalous, they get away with it. If Trump has some classified documents, even if he had the right to declassify them, let's send the FBI to raid his house and arrest him. But when Hillary does it, let's just let her get away with it. Let's continue. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. So in other words, election interference. He's interfering with the normal process of electing leaders. Might you see some of that happening today? Might you see that certain social media and streaming websites will block content that interferes with the election or should I say selection of their particular candidate, all in the name of so-called protecting democracy. But they're not protecting democracy. They're protecting Democrats. Let's continue. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. In other words, King George III made it harder for immigrants to come to the United States legally and resettle there and integrate into the American way of life. Notice, these founders are actually complaining about not being able to have foreigners come here legally. So for all of you out there who would say that the founders were a bunch of bigots and they only respected themselves and they just didn't care about other nations, I would love to show you this little passage here in the Declaration of Independence where the founders are actually for legal immigration. They are not for anybody just come because you want to, which is why they talk about up here the dangers of invasion from without, but at the same time they believed in a natural process, a naturalization process. That is what the founders wanted. The founders believed if you are to come to America, you must do so legally. That should erase this concern that the founders were all a bunch of bigots. Let's continue. What else do they have to say to complain about King George III? He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. So in other words, King George III had weaponized his Justice Department to make unfair judgments based on his political agenda as opposed to the actual facts of the case and actual truth. You've seen this, haven't you? In America, you will see an FBI that would rather investigate the mom who just wants her kids to get a normal education, doesn't want them transed up. She speaks out at the school board meeting, and the FBI writes a memo on her, calls her a terrorist, and starts following her around, but they'll let Antifa go. They'll let Black Lives Matter rioters go, but the concerned mom who just wants her kids to have a normal childhood, she's getting called a terrorist. This is upside down justice, and you still see even more abuses happening today. Think about the Kyle Rittenhouse case. He clearly defended himself from some violent rioters who were trying to kill him with a skateboard. One man was trying to decapitate him with a skateboard, and he used a rifle to defend himself, and he was the one that wound up in court having to defend his rights, even though he did the right thing. When in your country, it becomes more legally risky to do the right thing than to be a coward, your government hates you. Your government is trying to abuse you. Let's continue. What else has King George III done? He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and to eat out their substance. Now, it says he has erected a multitude of new offices and swarms of officers. Think about the fact that Joe Biden just created 87,000 new IRS agents and then passed a law to give them all guns. The whole purpose of the IRS is to collect taxes, but now they're collecting taxes from people at the point of a gun. How is that not racketeering? How is that not gang activity? How is that not some kind of mafioso move of pay your protection money or we bust your kneecaps? That is criminal harassment of people. And there are other federal agencies. I believe that some people in the Department of Transportation, as well as the Department of Energy, are being given firearms. For what purpose? Why are these people being given so many automatic weapons? Even the people that drive the trains. Look this up. Why are all of our three-letter agencies getting armed to the teeth while the president that's arming them is trying to take away your rifle? Think about that for a second. Let's continue. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Now, We need to actually understand this. This is something that is hard for us to digest, especially those of you who have military families, and especially a lot of you who maybe were in the Navy or the Marines or the Army or even the Air Force. After you left the service, you became a civil contractor for those same branches that you once served in. And if you've served in our armed forces, I want to let you know you took a very brave job. I'm just going to let you know that was very brave of you. I give you that credit. However, what we need to understand is the founders of our nation did not intend for military-age men to be walking around intimidating American people into submission. That is not the purpose. Every man who knows how to use a rifle or a shotgun or a pistol is responsible for defending the nation in times of invasion from without or in times of civil distress from within. Hence why when you take an oath to the Constitution, you swear to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But the intent of the military, as the founders believed it to be, they wanted a military that could coalesce, come together in times of need, but in times of peace it would dissipate, so that the people don't walk around in fear that if they say the wrong thing, their president is going to bomb them with F-16 fighters because they own an AR-15. Because right now, the power that the military has and the might that it has and the way it has been used abroad, now we have presidents that are using that F-16 that you probably, when you were in the service, you flew it faithfully, you used it to serve your country. Now we have a president who is saying he wants to use that on, or is threatening to use that on Americans who don't want to turn in their AR-15s. Let that sink in. I am not saying, nor are the founders saying, that the military is in and of itself bad. But what is being said is when you have a professional military that's kept at all times for intimidating civilians, that is a problem. Civilians ought to control the military, not the other way around. Remember, the government's rights come from you, not yours from the government. And the military, being that it's part of the government, is no different whatsoever. Let's continue here. He said, the founders say, he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Now, let's think about that for a second. This is a document written by the founders of our nation who are complaining that their supposed leader is following the laws of other governmental bodies and trying to subject our foreparents to those laws. And yes, that is happening today. How many times have you seen American-based organizations and the federal government bend the knee to the World Health Organization or to the UN? At what point does NATO's will and needs become more important than America's need and America's will? At what point do the UN and the World Health Organization take precedence over Americans' needs? This is the America Last mentality, and King George III had it just as badly as Joe Biden has it today. Now, here are some of the pretend legislation. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment from any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. So, in other words, the deep state. A mock trial meaning, okay, you have someone who's involved in governmental business, who's been corrupt this whole time and abusing people. We're going to let that person go with a slap on the wrist because they're part of the deep state. They're part of the system. Think about Hunter Biden, for example. He got what? Some probation? When if you or I had committed half of what he'd done, we'd be going to prison for the rest of our natural life, but he gets away with it. Hillary Clinton got away with it. The war crimes that George Bush committed, never once impeached, got away with it. So you have a history of criminals in Congress. Insider trading. Nancy Pelosi has never seen the inside of a jail cell. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. You saw that when Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. That's what Joe Biden's executive order on the student loan forgiveness would have been, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of a trial by jury. Think about Ashley Babbitt. Think about some of the people in J6. They got treated irresponsibly by the justice system, by law enforcement, kept in cells for God knows how long without the ability to have a speedy trial, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offensives. I think of the ATF with that. A pretended offense, that is when somebody is just making up the law as they go in such a way to try to get you in trouble, to try to get you in prison. Oh, well, that triangular shaped plastic at the back of your pistol, that makes it an SBR. You go to register it or go to jail. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. The United States does have puppet regimes that their intelligence communities have used to oppress those people. This is something we see today. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. That is something that you actually see the left wants to do today, through packing the Supreme Court, for example. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us all in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Now that is something that we need to understand very seriously. When Joe Biden stood on that stage with 2 Marines behind him in a blood red backdrop and compared half of the country, compared conservative Americans to terrorists and extremists, and basically said that they have no place here, how is that not waging war against those people, or at least declaring it? And then later on he goes to say that if you don't want to give up your AR-15, that I have an F-16 to crush you. I don't understand how Joe Biden's any different from King George III. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun, with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. Now, you actually have this happening nowadays. Think about the open borders. Did you know it's more than just some Mexicans who want to pick some strawberries in Arizona coming across our borders? You have Chinese military operatives coming over the border. You have Middle Eastern terrorists coming over the border. You have cartels that are terrorists in and of themselves coming over the border. That is transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to this land. So again, no different today than yesteryear. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. In other words, trying to set Americans against other Americans and trying to use the military, trying to use the Navy, trying to use those F-16s against fellow Americans. He has excited domestic insurrections among us. Let's stop there. I want to reread that. Look what the founder said. He has excited domestic insurrections among us. Do you remember during the 2020 political campaign when Kamala Harris was using her funds to bail out these rioters? She became part of the Biden regime. The Biden regime is responsible for some of the blood that is on the hands of Americans. This is still happening today, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now, when he said Indian savages, I took that personally because, frankly, I'm of indigenous American descent. I've made this known in many of my videos, but I believe that what he's saying here is that the particular natives that they were fighting against were willing to kill the old and the young, men and women, the healthy and the feeble. So they were fighting against people who would kill anyone that breathes. Now, here's something that's important to understand. We have a lot of this going on today. We have race riots going on in America that are all worse under Democrat presidents. Remember the Michael Brown incident when Obama was president, if I'm recalling that correctly? Fact check me on that. And then you have all of these incidences that are taking place under the Biden regime. So racial divisions and people of different skin colors killing each other, this is something that is going on now and continues to occur. And every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. In other words, we've asked you to help us out as calmly as we could. That's basically what that means. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. In other words, King George III is such a dictator that if you want to remain free, you should not fall under his rule. He's not fit to rule a free people. Think about the bravery of the founders to do this. Back in those days, kings reigned supreme. Almost every country in Europe had a monarchy ruling them. And for these people to stand up against their king in such bold terms took great bravery. Let's continue here. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislator to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. So in other words, the founders themselves contacted the people in Britain and told them, hey, go talk to your legislator, go talk to Parliament and get them to ease up on us. So please understand that the founders were not just a bunch of angry rebels who had no thought to what they did and just picked up their guns and decided to start shooting people. They tried every avenue possible to get the attention of their rulers, and they had no choice in what they did. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. So in other words, we've tried to appeal to their better nature. That's what it means by appealing to their native justice and magnanimity. And we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations which would inevitably interrupt our connection and correspondence. So in other words, the founders were talking to the people in England and saying, hey, we're all fellow English citizens here. We're all descendants of the same people. Let's treat each other with kindness. You wouldn't want to hurt your brother, would you? That's basically the attitude that the founders had. What we need to understand is that the founders viewed themselves as Englishmen. And they were trying everything in their power to stay Englishmen and not have to form their own country. They wanted every way possible to keep what was in place, but it just became unsustainable. At a certain point, you have to realize when a government no longer deserves to stay in place. Let's continue. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. What does consanguinity mean? It means you having the same ancestry as someone. For example, you and your brother would have more consanguinity than you and a cousin. You and a cousin have more consanguinity than you and like your third or your fourth cousin. So what was basically going on is that, and I've seen this, I've read about this happening across many European settlements. This is part of the attitude that caused the Mexicans to declare independence from Spain, part of the attitude that caused Brazil to declare independence from Portugal. A lot of times, people that live in a distant colony are treated like they don't matter. Oh, you're not near the center of our government, so your rights come last. So the king was only concerned about people that lived in England. He didn't care about the English citizens that lived abroad. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, peace in peace, friends. In other words, we can't rely on these, our fellow British people. Just because they share our ancestry does not mean they share our ideals. How many times do you see in modern America, they try to break people up into racial blocks? Oh, you're black, therefore you must think this way. You're white, therefore you must think this way. You're Asian, therefore you must think this way. Here in the Declaration of Independence, we see nuance in the history of our nation. Two nations or two groups of people with consanguinity, with kindred blood, and they're ready to go to war with each other. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world, again, another reference to God for those of you who want to try to force atheism into our law books. Anyway, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions due in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Look how that declaration ended. Divine providence and sacred honor. There is a God, and this nation was founded on that principle. Happy 4th, and God bless.